As trade talks continue to circulate around Montreal's plethora of defensemen, one Habs personality, Simon Snake Boisvert, suggests that Logan Mailloux gets shipped off, as he also makes a kind of crazy claim about what he believes Logan Mailloux's ceiling is. We're going to get into all of that. Plus, a great article from Marco D'Amico goes into a single mistake that the Habs cannot make that the Senators have made, and even the Habs have made in the past. We're going to get into what all this means coming up on this episode of Habs Digest. We're going to jump straight into this. This cannot happen. First of all, this cannot happen. This is a wonderful article from Marco D'Amico, and I will link it down below, and I suggest you go read it because there's a lot more to it than we're going to be able to present here, but it gave some really good insights. And, well, he said some stuff about certain Habs prospects. This is a prospect trade-heavy episode, and we're going to get into the first thing he said. He said, there's one major error that their rivals have made that should be avoided if they wish to hit another level in the coming years: holding on to underperforming prospects too long. He goes on to say the Canadiens have been guilty of this, ultimately trading former first-round picks like Louis Leblanc, Michael McCarron, and more for pennies on the dollar. There were Sherbacks, there were Julesons and Metes who were lost to waivers. And one final thing I wanted to point out here, he said players like Heineman, like Farrell, like Riley Kidney, William Trudeau, and even maybe Jordan Harris or Justin Barron are some of the younger players that the Habs will need to evaluate in a very direct way this coming season. And when we look at some of these guys, Jesse, I'll cycle through a couple of these guys like Kidney and Harris here. Like, what do you think of this? I think overall this is a great take. He goes on to talk about how Ottawa has done kind of the same thing with guys like Lassie Thompson, even now Bernard Docker, who's starting to get into the NHL. I mean, you can't just go trade everyone. But at the same time, the last thing you want to do is hold on to guys for too long when their value is at their lowest.
Absolutely. You want to avoid a cautionary tale, kind of like the Buffalo Sabres. 13 years, right, not being able to make the playoffs, right? And a lot of that comes to kind of prospect mismanagement, knowing which guys are going to pop and which ones aren't. But I would say it's not just the young players of knowing which one of those isn't going to be part of the long term, but also by getting rid of those older vets, which you know are not going to be part of your team, right? Because that's what allows for your younger guys to get in the lineup, and you're really able to see what you have in them. Now, of course, like we can't wait too long, and it's almost a situation where it's like you have so many guys where obviously like you're being in a position now where you're forced to trade, right? Which, you know, is kind of okay sometimes because you want to wait and you want to see, right? Obviously, like Justin Barron comes up the most as like a very high likely candidate to be traded sooner than later. But Kent Hughes in that 2-year deal, he still wants to give a little bit of time to see, right? To see what these players have, because we know like already the chances of making the NHL as a prospect are very low. You then put into that the fact that the Montreal Canadiens have so much, right? And that, you know, decreases dramatically, right? So absolutely, we do need to cash in, but we also need to be looking at our vet players that don't really fit our team as well.
That's a great point too, right? Because this is all about prospect management. It's not just about trading away underperforming prospects. And while that is a big thing, like Marco highlights, like making room for prospects is what allows them to perform. And when we talk about underperforming, some of them underperform with lots of ice time. And that's the last thing you want. I think that's one thing he's saying you need to avoid. But in order to get the most out of your guys, you have to put them in the position to succeed. And honestly, Jesse, I think it's underratedly difficult to have a prospect system like Montreal does, one of the best in the whole NHL, to be able to find ice time for all these guys. I mean, we're talking about guys like how Mailloux and Reinbacher are both probably going to start in the AHL, potentially even Hudson this year. And you have guys like that who would probably make that jump to the NHL for many, many other teams. It's just that, you know, Montreal at this point has such a backlog, right? And not only veterans on defense, some of them are going to get moved, whether it's Savard, maybe Matheson, who knows? He's been always in rumors as well. But to give these guys a chance is what matters a lot. Now, we got guys like Jared Davidson, we got guys like Sean Farrell, and we got guys like Kidney, who we saw have flashes of greatness, but just couldn't quite put it together in Laval. They got bumped up by some other guys like Philippe Maillet or Brandon Gignac, who had great seasons. How much do you think they're going to put an emphasis on really trying to get the young guys to play more? Now, this coming season in Laval, Jesse, is going to be one of the youngest teams, maybe even the youngest in the AHL, I'm not sure, but I think that's got to be one of the priorities for new head coach Pascal Vincent down there, to make sure that you're at least showing off your prospects to the best of your ability.
And not just with Laval, but they're going to be creating spots and opening spots with the Montreal Canadiens as well. And that's why, even though we've discussed like a Christian Dvorak trade, and obviously like his value increases by kind of waiting for his value to go up. At the same time, you got to think of maybe some value that you're blocking, right, by having him maybe in the way of another young player's playing time there. So it's all really things to kind of consider as we're going forward, right? But like, you got to feel like the young guys, they're going to get that opportunity, but it's really going to be up to them to make the most of it. Because if not, they're going to have to make some quick decisions. Even a player that we both like, Josh, like Emil Heineman, right? Like, this is a big year for him because he's the type of player where it's like, obviously, to get value, you're going to need to trade some of our prospects that look like they have some promise and some opportunities, right? So we're going to need to see that quick, and then make some judgments off that fairly quickly as well.
It's going to be kind of a crazy season to keep track of in the AHL and the NHL because, I mean, look, things have to happen. And whether it is a trade or not, a lot of it, though, is going to be the roster management to see who makes the roster where, who gets the playing time over other people, who's working harder. That stuff, some of the underrated stuff that flies under the radar. But let us know your thoughts on this down below. Which one of these guys do you think should probably be traded before maybe their value drops off a cliff even more? But speaking of guys who might be traded, is Logan Mailloux going to get shipped? I don't know. I mean, this was definitely a guy that's on my mind, Jesse, as one of the Habs' higher value prospects that sort of is expendable in a way. We've talked about this a lot, how he's similar to Justin Barron in a lot of ways, probably with a higher ceiling than Justin Barron, but you also have Reinbacher coming up behind. You only have a certain amount of defensive spots, so like, if you really want to use one of your better prospects in a trade, Mailloux kind of makes sense. And honestly, that's what Simon Snake Boisvert recently said on an episode of the Sick podcast. I want to bring up what he had to say. This is a poor picture. I cropped his eye out. That's my fault. I still think Mailloux is a third pairing guy at best. Now, first of all, that's been a take he's had for a while. It's not a new take. I still really don't agree with it, but it's okay. This was a great segment. Third pairing guy at best, and I wouldn't be surprised if at some point he got traded. He went on to say, I think Mailloux could be the one to get traded because he will still have, I think, my bad, good value to other teams like the Habs did with Romanov. And he went on to say, I see with Mailloux the same kind of thing happening as what happened with Romanov. And it's just a guess. But he seems pretty confident, Jesse, that the Logan Mailloux is one of these expendable guys, a guy who's third pairing at best. And honestly, if his defense doesn't really come around, I mean, his offensive potential is nuclear, I think. He'd be a 6'3" guy with the amount of skating ability and shot ability he has. I know his defense isn't quite there. But, I mean, look, Barron was playing third pairing minutes. I think eventually his ceiling is much higher than the third pairing guy, maybe second pairing. I hate to keep comparing the two, but they're similar in a lot of ways. I do think Mailloux has a higher ceiling, but at the same time, like, I kind of agree here. I kind of look at these guys like a guy that we're treating as a really good player. I think we're treating Mailloux higher than we did Romanov at the time. But to have him in a package for another big trade for a better player, Jesse, to me, it actually does kind of make sense to pick him as that guy.
For me, Mailloux has more value than a Romanov type. Just the fact, they're two young kind of, skilled players. But at the same time, like, with Romanov being that left D, for Mailloux being that right D, I think that's kind of something that makes him a lot more untouchable, in my opinion, right? Like, if we're looking at, like, purely offensive guys for the Habs, we got Hudson, we got Mailloux, we got Matheson, and we got Barron, right? Like, Barron and Mailloux, those are those two right-handed guys. Out of those two right-handed, you have to feel like Barron is much more of a likely trade candidate. I'd see Barron going much quicker, right? Like, Mailloux, even though he's not good defensively, with that size, with the right coaching, you'd have to feel like that part of his game's going to improve. I'd say, like, his potential has to be at least that of a top four with the numbers that he's put up, in the AHL, right? So, it's really interesting to see when we're kind of making these projections kind of going forward. But for me, like, Mailloux is a guy that has that value. I don't know. I'd kind of see more of a Barron type of trade before him.
Interesting. I actually don't mind that either, but I also think it depends on the situation of the team trading. Like, I know they're about the same age. I think Barron's like 1 year older, maybe not even that. Like, they're pretty similar in age. I think Barron's like a year, maybe a year and a half older. But at the same time, it's like Barron has that NHL experience. Mailloux doesn't yet, though he'll probably get a bit more this season. I guess that kind of goes back to that first thing we were talking about. Like, what if Mailloux doesn't get it together on defense? I still think he could. Is his offense enough to carry him? And, I mean, Barron still has some work to do on the defensive end as well, but he's already kind of established. Like, right now, would you say Mailloux has a higher trade value than Barron? And if he does, then do you think Montreal's depth, like, just say, okay, Mailloux, you're gone. We're going to take Barron, which we think, say, 80% in general of your value. Let's say they value Barron at like 75-80% of what Mailloux could be. To them, could that difference in trade value versus what they see the value is in their player be enough to ship Mailloux out in a potential trade for a good player over a Barron? I think that's where I'm leaning. Like, Mailloux to me feels like a much better sweetener for a team that wants a prospect than a Baron does at this moment, which is why I think if they want a big, good player, he might just be the guy.
Yeah, just the one thing is with him being that right-hand D, right?
Yeah.
I know we got Rybacker coming up, but, you know, we're a lot thinner on that. We know that Savard's going to be a UFA, right, at the end of this year. So it's just that's the one kind of separating thing. But for sure, the trade value for Logan Mailloux is higher than that for Justin Barron. So that is what makes him more appetizing in the type of trade. And for sure, it is a fair point that you need to give value to kind of get value. And get back to our earlier point is that sometimes you need to do that before kind of some of those weaknesses in their games kind of get shown super, super clearly, right? So this would be saying a bet that, you know, Mailloux is not going to pan out. And it's for this reason that we should trade him before his value goes down too much. But I'm big on this player, and even a lot of the fans in the show, right? Like when we're doing our prospect, Mailloux was really high on the list. I know this a lot of our fans at Habs Digest, like we're watching hockey all the time, right? So for me, that definitely, it counts for something. He's going to need to learn to kind of round out his defensive game, but like offensively, already in his time with the Montreal Canadiens last year, that one game, he played so well. He looked like he belonged. I have a hard time seeing of like where he's starting at a third pairing with the Montreal Canadiens looking so good that that's his ceiling and that he could never be better than that. I think you want to take a bet on Logan Mailloux, and for that reason, and for him being a right-hand defenseman, even though we got lots, injuries happen. You want to hold on to these guys, and I think he's a keeper.
Yeah, you know what? Honestly, I think the one thing, I know his defensive game, to me, that takes a while to work on. The one biggest difference for Mailloux coming this year, Jesse, is if he even improves his decision-making by, say, 50%, he's going to look like a completely different player on the ice. He's going to look a lot more calm. We're going to start having those conversations. Oh, wow, he's calm, cool, because some of his decisions were not great this year. That, to me, is one of the bigger factors, too. But let us know down below what you think about Mailloux. We could talk about him for ages and ages and ages, but it looks like he's going to finally get a decent break with Montreal this season at some point, at least we hope, just to see what kind of player he's going to be. But that'll do it for this episode of Habs Digest. If you enjoyed, leave a like, comment, subscribe to the channel. Thank you all so much for supporting us every single day. I'm Josh Gosse alongside my co-host, Jesse Poirier. We'll catch you in the next one.